Hello, my name's Jane Mann, and I'm very excited to be here today to help launch the new Digital Education Futures Initiative at Cambridge, or DEFI. DEFI will help drive forward global exploration of the possibilities that digital technology opens up for education, not only acting as a centre for close to practice research into education and technology, but also as a hub for discussion and thought. So it's great to see the beginning of that hub role today as we join together researchers, policymakers, industry experts and allies to begin this conversation. As the Managing Director of the Cambridge Partnership for Education, I'm delighted to be supporting today's launch. Cambridge Partnership for Education is a new unit which brings together expertise in education reform from across Cambridge University, including Cambridge University Press and Cambridge Assessment. We work in partnership with ministries of education and other clients around the world to develop quality, coherent and resilient education systems. The collective knowledge of the University of Cambridge is integral to what we do, and that's why the Cambridge Partnership for Education team and I are really looking forward to working closely with DEFI to ensure that findings and discussion inform best practice in our work and the best results for our partners and their teachers and learners. So in a few minutes, you'll be hearing from Andreas Schleicher on the importance of research on the future of education and on the use of technology in education, and also from Professor Mmantsetsa Marope on the importance of translating research findings into impactful programmes. We'll also get perspectives from some early DEFI industry supporters, Nick Sample from ARM Education and Jeff Xu from Dipont Education. But before that, I'd like to introduce someone who can share much more information about the aims and aspirations of DEFI. Rupert Wegerif is Professor of Education at the University of Cambridge, and he is Director of DEFI, which is based at Hughes Hall. Rupert's been researching educational technology for 30 years and is working on a theory of education which is appropriate for the internet age. He's co-lead with Sarah Hennessy of the Cambridge Educational Dialogue Research Group and co-convener of the Argumentation, Reason and Dialogue Special Interest Group of the European Association of Research on Learning and Instruction. Over to you, Rupert.
Oh, thanks very much, Jane. And thanks very much to everybody for coming, especially to our speakers, Andreas Schleicher and Professor Mmantsetsa Marope. I'm really looking forward to thinking together about the future of education. These have been very challenging times for education. I'm personally impressed by how institutions like this one and others around the world have adapted to this crisis that we're living through. But many of those adaptations have revealed new possibilities for education, and therefore the need for us to seriously think through how we want to design education for the future, looking specifically from the perspective not of how we can do the things that we have done, of the perspective of the past, but of what we're all going to need together for the future as it's changing so rapidly. And what has been revealed are new possibilities that are only there because of the internet, mobile phones, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and these need serious research together. There are enthusiastic voices, there are many critical voices, so we hope that this new centre at Cambridge can provide a more careful academic analysis of the theory. As Jane said, I'm very interested in the theory. We have to look at all the implications of new initiatives, but perhaps even more importantly, to provide an evidence base that policymakers can use in making decisions. And to do that, of course, we're going to need your support. So I hope you can watch this space and join us. One of our many projects that I just want to mention briefly that we have support for and will be taking forward immediately is to provide a global platform for practitioners and teachers to share their research. The Classroom Learning Research Exchange led by Dr. Pete Dudley with the support of Dr. Sarah Hennessy. So if you're interested in that, please get in touch. And if you're interested in any of our projects, watch this space and we hope there'll be exciting developments. And do put any questions you have in the chat and we'll visit them later. We hope you can join us in thinking seriously about the future of education. I'll now hand back to Jane.
Thanks, Rupert. There's lots there to look forward to, I can see, which is great. So to our first guest speaker, Andreas Schleicher is Director for Education and Skills at the OECD. Andreas initiated and oversees the Programme for International Student Assessment, or PISA as we all know it, and other international instruments that have created a global platform for policymakers, researchers and educators across nations and cultures to innovate and transform educational policies and practices. Andreas has worked for over 20 years with ministers and education leaders to improve education. And Andreas is going to share some thoughts with us now on the importance of research on the future of education and on the use of technology in education. Thanks, Andreas.
Thank you, Jane. And first of all, my congratulations to DEFI. I do think, in these times where we are all absorbed with the urgent, how to fight the pandemic, how to sort of keep schools open, it is so important to have people who think beyond the horizon and think towards the future. So congratulations. I think it's a great initiative, very, very much needed. Let me just, share my screen just to give you a few sort of indications. At the OECD, as you know, we pay a lot of attention to tracking performance of education, to looking at quality. And, we started that actually back in the early 2000s. And the world in which we lived in that was a very different one. If you think about something like reading skills, it was about, extracting knowledge from carefully curated, prefabricated books. When you didn't know the answer to a question, you could look it up in an encyclopedia. You could trust that answer to be true. When you read today on the internet, nobody tells you what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true. Literacy is no longer about just extracting knowledge. It's really about constructing knowledge now. And we could see that kicking in, in the early 2000s, the technologies that we take for granted today started to emerge. But when we looked at the reading skills of young people, the capacity to navigate information, manage complex kind of information structures, we couldn't really see any change in the industrialized world. 2006, the year before the iPhone was invented, we did our third PISA assessment, and same story. Twitter was still a sound in those days. And again, nothing really changed in most education systems. Now, 2009, remember social media really kicking in, changing again the way in which we communicate, in which we learn. You can look further, 2012, robotics, cloud computing, biogenetics, big data. Once again, changing the world around us, or 2015, 2018, the emergence of artificial intelligence, pushing us to think so much harder what makes us human, not how we educate, second-class robots, but people who can, complement the artificial intelligence that we created. But as you can see, that line of learning outcomes has remained virtually flat. And, despite the fact that we invest a lot more in education now than we did in the early 2000s. Now you can argue, well, it's not true everywhere. You have, countries like Estonia, like China, Vietnam, Poland, Portugal, that have sort of backed that trend and keep improving, keep changing, keep innovating. But that's just about, a handful of systems in 100. So overall, I think we need to think hard about that trend. And I just want to leave you with one number here. When you think about it, only 1 in 10 students in the industrialized world at age 15 can reliably distinguish a fact from an opinion. Now, when the context gets complicated, I admit this, these are quite challenging tasks. And you can argue, well, it's a little bit better than it was in the year 2000, when that was 7% in the wealthy countries, the OECD. But again, we live in a totally different world. That's really why I think your work is so important. The world is changing rapidly, and education has a very, very hard time to adapt. And it's not about doing more of the same. There is huge variability in the volume of learning time across countries. You can see that here, blue, the time that students spend learning in school, and then yellow, what they do out of school in terms of tutoring, homework, and other things. You take a country like the United Arab Emirates, where you can see students learning close to 60 hours per week. And you can contrast that with Finland on the left side, less of just about half of that time, 37 hours. Huge variation in the volume of learning time. But then when you look at, productivity, you can see in a country like Finland, students learn a lot in very little time, while in the United Arab Emirates, they spend a lot of time and learn comparatively little. So is not so much about volume, it's really about productivity. And even countries, that we often think about, talk about a lot, Singapore, one of the highest performing education systems, but it's largely effort. When you look at, productivity, learning gains per hour of instruction, just, so. That's what we have to work on. Money and time are not great predictors of the quality of an education system, but, then you can look at growth mindset, the underpinning mindsets in students. They're actually almost, very good predictors of learning outcomes. You can see countries like Estonia, doing well on an assessment like PISA, also students owning their learning, believing, that learning, that effort is going to make a difference. Contrast that with a country like Indonesia, where, students are not doing that well in learning and also believe that, success is very much about inherited intelligence. And we can change those kinds of constructs. They vary as much as the results of learning. By the way, that growth mindset was not just important, for PISA scores. You could also see where students had more of a growth mindset. They were more inclined to tackle complicated tasks. Now, they had a greater sense of self-efficacy. They were less afraid of failure. They were more ready to establish ambitious learning goals or even see greater value in schooling. So again, and many of those are the attributes that we need in this 21st century. People who are, at the frontier of things, you're going to enterprise, you try out new things. And then, of course, the big elephant is always digitalization. That's what you're working on. You can say it's incredibly democratizing. Everybody can collaborate, everybody can contribute in education, in society. But it's also, concentrating power at a rate that we have never seen before. Few big companies, taking on everything. Technology is incredibly particularizing. The smallest voice can be heard everywhere. You post something on Twitter and the world can follow you. But it's also incredibly homogenizing, squashing individual cultural differences. Questions around identity are also very much with us in the future of education. Technology has been incredibly empowering. The most successful companies these days, they're not created by a big industry. They're created by a big idea. Now, they have the product before they have the money. Very, very different. But it can also be incredibly disempowering when we become the slave of algorithms. And that is directly relevant to education. Technology can be hugely empowering in terms of innovative learning environments, but it can also make learning more scripted, more stifled. It can disempower teaching, reduce teaching. Where we end up on the slide has a lot to do with how we think about the future of education. It's not just education, our economies. If you think about businesses today, it's about platform technologies, the big enabling platforms. You no longer know who is a big or a small company. A few people can change the world, can have a huge footprint. You no longer know who is the consumer and who is the business. Again, very, very different from the past. Government's starting to work with platforms. And I just want to show you one slide of data from our survey of adult skills that I think is hugely relevant to the future of education. Where we work in more digitally, focused environments, we are more likely to learn from co-workers. We are more likely to learn by doing. We are more likely to invest in lifelong learning to keep up to date. The digital world of learning is a hugely empowering world of learning. So I think that's something that we can, draw on in education. So let's think about the future. I think one thing is clear, the future is always going to surprise us. Today it's a pandemic, tomorrow, climate change is going to be a big kind of thing having a huge impact. Artificial intelligence, also probably going to likely be hugely impactful on everything that we do and think. And it's associated with a much greater degree of uncertainty. And then there are lots of other things that are going to continue to shape the future of education. We at the OECD, we're studying those trends carefully. Every 2 years, we put out a book, what are those big kind of trends shaping education? And I think also in education, we should get less hung up on, making predictions and be more open to different futures. Imagine those different futures and what those futures mean for education policy and practice. No, one possibility obviously is, the status quo will continue. Educational monopolies will remain, teachers will teach, students will learn, and it's quite possible, the status quo will always have many protectors. But then, what are the implications for the goals and the functions of education, for governance, for the organization of learning, for educators? What is very clear is that innovating large bureaucratic schooling system is always going to require a very high degree of consensus, a lot of communication with a lot of stakeholders. And the question is, can such systems be agile, adaptive, responsive enough? We should ask this question. We know, for example, again, that it's very, very hard to get people from the front line involved in changing their own systems, their own working environments. There is a huge asymmetry between the costs and benefits of educational change that, if you think about the future, you have to tackle this. The costs of educational change are certain, they are immediate. Benefits are always, uncertain, long-term. That's the hardest nut to crack. We have very complex governance systems. We have a lack of supportive ecosystems. In the medical sector, in 10 months' time, people could come up with a revolutionary technique to immunize billions of people. What have we done in education in those 10 months on a global scale? We do not have that kind of education industry that is underpinning what's happening in the front line. Very, very huge kind of challenge. And then for policymakers, you can lose an election over education. When something small gets wrong, you rarely win an election over education just because it takes so much time to translate better ideas, better outcomes. And that really makes it hard. That's, why despite all the changes that we have seen over the last months, I think this COVID pandemic has, pushed huge amount of not just technological innovation, but also social innovation. But will we sustain it? We have to work on this. It's not going to be taken for granted. Perhaps traditional schooling systems are going to break down. We see learning taking place in much more diverse arrangements. The parents going to make different choices. In the pandemic, that has certainly also been part of this. But then again, how are we going to reconcile, quality, equity with choice and those kinds of things? When we surveyed countries, one of the most interesting findings for me was that, in May last year, only about 22% of education systems wanted to go back to where they come from, return to normal scheduling. Half of the education system saw hybrid learning as the long-term future, well beyond the pandemic. And you think about it, a year before that, that was a very remote kind of perspective for most. Simply most education systems kept at the margins suddenly becomes the mainstream in a very, very short time. The mindset of people. But then, you just said it at the beginning, how do we move from just using technology to conserve what we do to actually using technology as a real game changer, as a transforming power? The number of trends, I think, that where we can be, very optimistic. The most visible benefit that we see from, artificial intelligence, augmented reality, virtual reality is so much greater personalization. While you study mathematics on a computer, that computer can now study how you study mathematics and then adapt learning in a way that is so much more granular, so much more adaptive, so much more responsive to your learning style than anything you could possibly get in a standardized kind of learning environment. That is real now. We can see those things emerging in a number of countries now. We can see, simulated environments. Why would you listen to a teacher explaining the results of an experiment when you can do that experiment in a virtual laboratory? I think those technologies have become real. We can see them. You can visit, good experiences. I think that's very important. One thing very close to my heart is, the field of assessment and exams. I believe, one of the most tragic mistakes that we made, some 100 years ago, is that we divorced learning and assessment. We pile up lots of amount of learning and then, we put students in a room and see whether they have understood it. I think with technology, we can reunite learning and assessment. 1,000 years ago, learning and assessment were always two sides of the same coin. And now with technology, we can make that happen for everyone. And I've seen great examples of this as well during the pandemic and even before, where, you know, while you learn, you get so much interesting feedback on how you learn. You get teachers get feedback on how to teach back. Systems get feedback on how to become more effective. Now, I think this is the future of assessment, of evaluation, where actually learning and assessment are going to be fully integrated. And we can also see very interesting environments in vocational education and training, where students do, you know, hands-on assessment in vocational settings, machine learning algorithms, scoring open-ended essays. Again, I think huge potential. Learning analytics, you know, maybe the most controversial part of this, you know, but that's where, you know, security, confidentiality, power of data really meet, and we have to struggle with very, very big questions now. But I do think that learning analytics holds the greatest promise in this field. Now, together with sensors and learning management systems, you know, teachers can now get a real sense of how different students learn differently in real time, and get that feedback to restructure, reorient their learning. And you can see, I mean, that's why I think China is extremely strong now already. So we should, you know, think about those kinds of possibilities when it comes to the future of learning. But, you know, technology is always only as good as it's being deployed, as it's being used. And you can see here on the chart, you can see many countries where it's just a minority of teachers who feel comfortable with the use of technology. On average, it's every second where you can see teachers frequently or always let students use technology for projects or classwork. At least that was the case in 2018. Probably it's changed a bit. And some countries are progressing rapidly. And when you look to countries like Sweden, Romania, Israel, Finland, UK, Croatia, you can see actually the share of teachers frequently using technology had doubled in a 5-year period, you know, in the run-up to the pandemic. That's quite impressive. But once again, that is not true everywhere. We live in a fast-changing world. Similar, you know, how do teachers learn? We talk about students learning digitally, but actually look at this. For most teachers, digital learning is still, you know, a very rare thing. The kind of courses, seminars that people attend in person are, you know, the dominant form of teacher learning. So again, you know, if we can't make that work for teachers, how do we expect to make it work for students? No? You take Korea and, you know, Shanghai in China, you know, they were the only two exceptions where you could see the digital learning world has become the kind of normal world of work for teachers. No? But in most other systems, it's still quite rare. No? Well, we could talk a long time about those kinds of things, but let me add a third scenario. Now, you know, that the first one, the second one was really about, you know, technology taking things over. We're seeing fragmentation in education provision, more choice, and so on. But what if the opposite happens? You know, what we see in countries like Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, where schools actually are not, you know, unraveling, but actually becoming more as community centers, integrating, you know, many more functions, becoming sort of centers of society. But again, you know, what does this mean in terms of capacity, in terms of, you know, frontline kind of innovation that you see? Or last but not least, you know, I know my time is almost up. Maybe one day traditional schools and functions of schools will be entirely overwritten by technology. Now, education learning is going to take place everywhere, anytime. We will no longer talk about the kind of institutional infrastructure. Innovation is going to scale very, very rapidly. But, you know, if digital infrastructure replaces physical infrastructure, now, learning is always a relational phenomenon. What is it going to do to the social fabric? I think that's one of the experiences that we've all seen in the pandemic, that learning is not just about the transaction of knowledge. It's very much a social and relational phenomenon. So huge questions. And again, I think, you know, what we should be doing better is to think about, you know, many more of those kinds of possibilities. And then, you know, what do they mean for the goals and functioning of education, for the organizational structures, for the educators' workforce, for the governance and geopolitics, and also, you know, what does it actually mean for public authorities? Think through the consequences. And when you understand those consequences, you have a much better idea of the future that you really, really want. And let me bring that just to conclude. You know, I think we need to think harder what is the right balance between modernizing and disruption. those two forces? How do we reconcile new goals with existing structures, very heavy structures? How do we support globally minded and locally rooted students and teachers? How do we foster innovation while recognizing the very conservative social nature of education? Education is perhaps the most conservative social systems that we have around us. How do we reconcile that with the idea of innovation? Everybody will tell you, I'm supporting innovation, except for my own child. How do we leverage potential with existing capacity? It's nice to dream of, new capacities, new teachers, new technologies, but actually, we work for a long time with the people that we have today. How do we actually make that happen? How do we reconfigure the spaces, the people, the technology, the time to empower more powerful learning environments? And that's certainly not just a government project. It's really a whole of society project. And let me conclude here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andreas. And you've left us with some tricky conundrums there to consider when it comes to balance. So I'm sure there's some questions arising, and if I could just remind you to put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box, and we'll get to those later. But we're now going to move on and hear some thoughts on the importance of translating research findings into impactful programs from our next guest speaker. Professor Mmantsetsa Marope is the Executive Director of the World Heritage Group and Honorary President of the Indian Ocean Comparative and International Education Societies. With a PhD in education and over 3 decades in university teaching in the World Bank and the UN system, Professor Marope's broad regional expertise and global expertise has seen her work with governments, regional economic communities, regional research networks with bilateral and multilateral agencies, on diverse themes on global education and early childhood care and development. Professor Marope has gained eminence as a global thought leader on the future of education and work and the future competencies that all global citizens require to thrive in rapidly changing 21st century work and life contexts. Over to you, Professor Marope.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mann. And let me thank Professor Wegerif and Dr. Mann and everybody else involved in the organization of this launch for inviting me to be part of this launch. I believe this is a very important initiative that we are launching today. And I'm going to focus, as Dr. Mann indicated, more on how do we make research have impact and what are the obstacles this initiative should be thinking of as we progress so that the work that they do bears dividend. I think we will all agree that the future of education and learning has never been so intensively debated, at least during my career span, as it has been over the first quarter of the 21st century. And as Andreas said, it's because this is a century that will always give us nice surprises and very fast changes, very disruptive changes, and changes that constantly make us question how do we prepare people for the futures that are unpredictable, that are rich in opportunities so that they can have the take-up capacity for those opportunities, but at the same time presents us challenges, particularly when we look at global inequalities to take up opportunities that are offered. In recent years, the high debate was how do we prepare learners of all ages for the surge of changes across all aspects of life that emerged out of the fourth industrial revolution. And over and above that, now we have had the devastating multiple shock of COVID. We are still reeling under that shock. Now, whatever the source of change we are talking about, whether it's the fourth industrial revolution, whether it's displacement of people, whether it's wars, conflict, whether it's questioning of universality of human values, and all those, how do we maintain social coherence in fractured context? All these questions somehow spin back to how can technology help us solve some of these challenges? And there has been a lot, there's hardly a debate or a conversation on education, especially a futuristic conversation, that does not focus quite specifically on the role of technology. It has its ups and downs, but that is not the focus of my talk. So let me congratulate the initiators of DEFI and highlight that DEFI seeks to significantly contribute to understanding the pedagogical affordances that are possible because of technology, which would have been either very difficult or nearly impossible given only our human potential and our human capabilities. So technology can offer a lot in the future. And I think Andreas has painted those potentials in broad strokes. Those of you who may have followed the end of 2020 dialogue on fixing the future of education that was hosted by Atlas of the Future in Catalonia may also recall that I did speak in detail about these possible affordances. Now, as we acknowledge that technology has both the potential, but it also has its own challenges, the emphasis with ITU and other agencies has always been technology for good, technology for the global public good. Now we are talking more and more about AI for good, but generally it's how can we use technology for good? And this is partly what I understood to be what DEFI is going to focus on, that yes, we are aware of some of these pedagogical affordances that technology can enable us to do. They've been mentioned in literature quite a lot, but what DEFI is highlighting is that the evidence on if and how they actually impact or guide the future of education and learning is still scanned. So a core element of DEFI will be to contribute to closing or filling knowledge gaps, evidence gaps on how technology can help us shape the future. So in doing research, we always do research, or mostly do research, with an assumption that it will be used either for just purposes of learning by other researchers and scholars, but also that it will translate into practice. It will influence policy, it will influence practice. But I want to highlight that while I agree with DEFI and I commend it for focusing on research, I also commend their close to practice approach research, because that then said, it's not enough just to do the research. Actually, the challenge isn't always that we don't have enough evidence-based knowledge that can help us shape the future of education and learning, but that in my view, we use far less of the evidence we already have. Even when you look at lower level resources like just data, if you look at how much data are in ministries of education, sit there, not analyzed, not really making their way into guiding policy and interventions. And there are many reasons why this, and that's what I'd like to focus on, to say to DEFI, as we proceed with research, we should not drop the focus on the need to deepen the brokerage of that research, for DEFI to do the research, but also to seriously consider being a bridge between the researchers or the creators of knowledge and those who may apply it. And I say this with a lot of trepidation because that's part of the difficulty we have in the education sector, that there tends to be a rather sharp divide between the creators and the users of knowledge. Whereas in the health field, you find there's more and more integration between the creation and the use of knowledge. And that's why the health sector can move so fast and can be agile and responsive and also be future forward, far much better than the education sector, I would say. But what are those barriers that I suggest DEFI should take into account when it shapes its knowledge brokerage aspect of its role? The first one is that if you look carefully, I've been working on this for quite some decades. If you look carefully, the institutional distance between the creator of knowledge and those who may apply it is part of the barrier. Most research is conducted by apex institutions like Cambridge, like universities, and it's created by individual researchers who are themselves consummate professionals or researchers. It's also created by independent institutes and so on and so forth. But the expectation, these people do not necessarily drive and manage the programs that will actually have impact on the future of education. They can inform how those programs should be designed, but if those who may use the evidence do not see this research as part of their public good, and it's seen as a university endeavor, then that institutional distance tends to be a barrier. And I want to give two examples of institutions that are different, because the risk, as I say, is more towards universities and independent research institutions. If you take the World Bank, for instance, the World Bank, also referred to sometimes as the Knowledge Bank because of the amount of knowledge creation that the bank does, combines in one institution the role of knowledge creation, knowledge brokerage, and knowledge application. And just very quickly, and because of this integration of these roles, which flow into a rather more smooth knowledge management continuum, you'll find that the research that the bank does finds much more easier pathway into the global education and policy and practice. But it's more than just the research, because the research is preceded by textured dialogue that either is responding to the need for research, like DEFI is doing, or it's building effective demand for that research, so that the users and the creators of knowledge begin to co-own the results of this research. The dialogue is sustained throughout the research, post the research, and when it comes to application, it's not this bifurcation of somebody creates knowledge, the other one will use it. So this, I think this is a model that I believe works, because that bridges the institutional distance that I was talking of. And that is a quite important factor. So if you have the dialogue, you create the knowledge, you facilitate its utilization through technical assistance. And then another leverage that the bank has is that it can finance the actual design of those transformative programs that emerge and that are informed by quite some rigorous analysis. Now, on the opposite side, and I've also worked for the educational East and Southern African Educational Research Network, whose role was to build research capacity and to support evidence-based policy and practice. But the network was a network of university professors who then engage in a rather episodic way with ministries of education and practitioners in education, with a lot of policy dialogue trying to push the agenda. But there isn't that seamless integration of upstream dialogue, midstream dialogue, downstream dialogue, and technical support to ensure that, as you would see in the bank. So Claude can ask the question, how far are you from the potential, your targeted users of the knowledge that you will produce, and what are the mechanisms for closing that distance, I think we have a better chance of the research that we'll do bearing the impact that we are aiming for. So I think this is one example that I would like to, one challenge, the institutional distance. The second challenge is the stature, the perceived stature, credibility, and visibility of the knowledge creating institution. I don't think DEFI, I'm sure, not I don't think, DEFI doesn't have any challenges with stature or credibility, but I'm not sure how visible what are the mechanisms for making your research visible and easily accessible so that it can permeate the thought processes of the partners that we want to use this research. I also want to highlight that just unawareness, which is lack of visibility of research and lack of access, this is particularly in developing countries and in disadvantaged areas within developed countries, where just literal access to research is a challenge, and you can't quite use what you don't have. You can't quite use what you are unaware of. So as we proceed to launch DEFI, what are the mechanisms that DEFI is going to put in place to make their work accessible just literally? The third challenge, the fourth challenge, is beyond literal access to substantive access. I may have a paper in my hand, a research paper, I may read it, but I might not even understand it or understand its implications for my practice. So physical literal access to research-based evidence does not translate into substantive access, which is understanding the research and understanding further its implications. This is more so for very complicated areas and emerging areas like the work that you want to focus on emerging technologies and their pedagogical affordances. You know, how many people pick a piece of research work on technology and the impact of technology on pedagogy and really understand the ins and outs of it enough to be able to translate it themselves? And how many people pick a study on the neuroscience or cognitive neuroscience and understand when they read it, let's say a teacher, a policymaker, understand what this paper is actually saying to their practice and to their policy? And therein lies again the role of knowledge brokers. And the role of the knowledge broker is to try to take a library approach to research and translate this research into simple, accessible language that makes very naked implications for policy and practice. Something that policymakers can read in a rush and practitioners can read in a rush and think and have that aha moment, oh, this is what this means for me. Now here I want to share an initiative that I launched while I was still at IBE, which focused on the sciences of learning. You know, Andreas was talking about how the outcomes, learning outcomes curve is rather flat. And in other countries, in less developed areas, the curve is going down. And with the devastating impact of COVID-19, we are at a high risk. COVID-19 has actually compounded the already existing global learning crisis. Now, given this compounding effect, what is it that we can do? The irony is that even before COVID-19, scientists of learning have always been working and compiling more and more and more better understanding of how humans learn. On the other hand is the frontline facilitators of learning, teachers, who do not have substantive access in the majority of the cases work that decides on how they should facilitate learning. So if you go to the IBE portal on the sciences of learning, you'll find that effort where I brought top-end cognitive neuroscientists, particularly, but other scientists of learning, to work with us at IBE as visiting fellows to translate their complex, interesting way of communicating their findings into simple, accessible language that clearly states what the implications are. And then we work that knowledge into our technical support, back to the circle that I talked about with an example from the bank, into our training programs. And now IBE, I hope they are continuing with that, is working on development of modularized teacher training curricula that member states of UNESCO can mainstream this sciences of learning into the training of future teachers. I'm going to try to be fast. Andreas mentioned this fairly quickly, but one of the barriers to applying research to improve our future is information overload. You just tap and try to find studies on topic X. You have an avalanche. Now, it takes a very sophisticated, advanced staff or person like the staff at DEFI to shift the wheat from the chaff and say, this is really robust research that is worth attending to, and go further and develop frameworks that create a gestalt out of these pieces of research, which can be very, very minute in their focus, and begin to re-articulate this body of research in a manner that makes its application possible. That's another area that how DEFI can position itself. And lastly, it's inaccessibility. When I started interacting with scientists of learning, I got a little fed up and thought, these guys are only interested in the next frontier of knowledge, and they couldn't care about the fire that's burning in classrooms and the global knowledge crisis. And as I interacted with them more, I found that they are also frustrated that the good work they are doing, they don't have an easy segue into the national or the global policy stream, education and practice stream. And an institution like UNESCO, and when I was at IBE, we deliberately wanted to use the convening power. Multilateral agencies have enormous convening power. And they have, because they are government owned at the base, they have easy access into the national and the global policy stream. And this is what these are some of the thoughts that DEFI needs to look at. How can we take the research that we are doing, because we want ultimately to improve the futures of education and learning, and find some route, some pathways into the national and even into the institutional, the national and the global policy and practice themes. So these are some of the thoughts that I just wanted to share about going beyond the creation of knowledge to enabling that knowledge to bear the impact that DEFI is aiming for. And again, congratulations for the initiative.
Thank you, Professor Marope. And you've raised some really important points there about bridging that institutional divide. And I think one of the things that grounds DEFI in the relevance of future education is the industry links it's already forged, and that commitment to strengthening those as the unit grows. So we'll hear now from two of DEFI's early industry partners and experts. Firstly, we'll hear from Nick Sample. Nick leads the ARM School programme, and he's a member of the UK Digital Skills Partnership Computing in Schools Delivery Group. And he also sits on the strategic board of the Cambridge Maths Hub. Nick.
Thank you, Jane, and thanks to all the speakers for today for sharing your insights and experience. It's been a pleasure to support this initiative with ARM Education and to work alongside Rupert and his team over the last 15 months. ARM is a semiconductor and software design company, so we're always thinking about the future. Our technology is at the heart of billions of devices, from supercomputers all the way through to smartphones. But we recognize that this technology is founded on the ideas and skills of our engineers, our computer scientists, data scientists, project managers, analysts, systems architects. And this is why we're passionate about STEM and computing education and its potential to shape futures. Not just the future of countries, societies, or industry sectors, but individual futures. I can offer a personal perspective on this. So I grew up in the northeast of England, where at a time when industry, to my family and to everyone at my schools, really meant coal and steel. Education made it possible for me to become part of an industry that my parents and teachers couldn't have imagined 30 years ago. Technological change of the kind enabled by ARM, such as AI and machine learning referred to in previous talks, are opening up new opportunities for education, but there are new challenges too, and complex questions that we want to engage with, such as how can we help young people to connect and identify with industries that shape their lives, but aren't visible in the way industry was when I was growing up? Which skills and knowledge should be addressed in today's classrooms, knowing that tomorrow's technology will have moved on in ways we can't yet imagine? How will technologies used by today's students shape the decisions they make as they enter the workplace, inherit the challenges facing the world, and shape the future for themselves? Looking back over decades of STEM education initiatives, there's a clear need for consolidation of efforts across education and industry. We believe it's important for the tech industry to engage constructively with high quality research into STEM and computing education. And at ARM and ARM Education, partnership is very much at the heart of everything we do. So we're delighted to see the launch of this new initiative today, and we hope to continue to work closely together. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. I'd now like to introduce Jeff Zhu, who joined Dipont Education Management Group in 2012 and is currently the Vice President leading the Division of Independent Schools. In addition, Jeff has served as acting board member and CEO of the Council for American Culture and Education in New York since 2011. Jeff.
Thank you, Jane, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Professor Wegerif, for the invitation to this event. And I'm very delighted to be here. And I would like to speak a little bit about the background of my organization and to share some of the reflections that we had since the pandemic. I worked for Dipont Education Group in China. Since the year 2003, when Dipont launched the first A-level program in China through the partnership with high school affiliate to Renmin University, Dipont has been at the forefront of changing the way education is thought about and delivered in China. So today we collaborate with 30 leading high schools in China in the management of 35 high school international centers. These centers offer A-level, advanced placement, and international baccalaureate programs to close to 10,000 students. And I'm proud to say that over the past 17 years, more than 30,000 students have graduated from our program and continued their pursuit of excellence in top universities in the world. In the year 2014, we took a major leap and entered the market of K-12 independent schools by partnering with renowned British and Chinese partners to establish and manage a new independent bilingual schools. And these schools, by servicing a diverse student body from kindergarten to grade 12, they integrate the best practice of Chinese and Western education and follow a holistic approach of educating the whole child. So today we have 3 schools, independent schools from kindergarten to grade 12, with a total enrollment of 3,600 students under our management. And nearly 1,000 international teachers. The largest group of expat teachers in Asia are currently teaching alongside our bilingual teachers at our high school centers, as well as the independent schools that we manage. The rapid economic growth and rising middle class in China have been the underlying causes for the rapid growth of private and international education in China. The socio-economic conditions of middle class are so diverse that the needs for education are dramatically different. As a result, the public education provided by the state, characterized by uniformity in curriculum, assessment tools, and teaching methods, could not meet the differentiated appetite for education within these middle-class families, therefore leaving a significant and growing sector of the population severely underserved. So since joining the WTO in 2001, China has embarked on a journey of evolution in education by augmenting the mainstream public education with private schools and bilingual international schools that provide differentiated education to Chinese families. Typically, these schools champion state-of-the-art facilities, a philosophy of educating the whole child, robust extracurricular programs, and strong pastoral care and boarding components. Teachers come from many countries in the world, and the student body is diverse in nationality. So I would like also to talk about a little about technology. We lived through the pandemic. Technology has sustained our schools and the school community in the difficult time of the pandemic. It enabled a seamless transition from in-person teaching in the classrooms to online, live, virtual seminars for all of our schools. It made it possible that we as a group stayed in close touch with every teacher of ours when they were stuck in many corners of the world because of the pandemic. It also has widened our view on education and propelled or forced us to think out of the box and design new ways of delivering the type of education we value. Human contact is indispensable in building character and nurturing leadership and the development of all kinds of skills amongst our children. There will always be classrooms, theaters, labs, libraries where teachers and students meet in person. But technology would strip off all the unnecessary lecturing and formalities and make the interactions more human than ever. It empowers our students to become more efficient learners and our teachers better advisors and mentors. At Dipont, we use technology to facilitate collaborations between teachers across disciplines and from different locations. The possibilities of new ideas and innovations sprout out of this sharing enabled by technology, in our view, are limitless. Therefore, we find the visions of DEFI echo many of the beliefs that we hold in education. On behalf of the founder of Dipont Education, Mr. Benson Zhang, I would like to express our congratulations and our best wishes to the success of the DEFI program. And also as a partner in the program, we are very delighted and honored to be involved in the exciting endeavor, much needed in today's world. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. And I think if there's one thing we have proved today is that there is a lot to talk about in this area. And the questions that you've asked have been fascinating and really deserve much better responses than we can give in the next 10 seconds or so. So what we will do is capture them and we will aim to get some thoughts back to you. Please make sure that you look in the chat box and engage with the network so that we can get back to you directly. And also, Rupert, I think this calls for another one of these get-togethers with much more time for Q&A. Perhaps we could invite people back for that at a future date.
Yes, thank you, Jane, and thanks to everybody, especially to the speakers who put forward such challenging and interesting ideas that we need to work on. And I've been looking at all the amazing questions. I'm sorry we don't have more time to respond to these questions, today. We'd like to keep this to a sort of, a limited slot, because we could go on forever. And we'd ideally love to invite you back here to Cambridge, and I'm sure we'll be able to do that soon and have some conferences and meetings. But meanwhile, I'm excited by the amount of interest that's been shown. So do keep in touch. Have a look out for our Twitter, which is @DEFI_Cambridge. Contact me through the website, and hopefully we can continue the dialogue together. A lot of people are asking, what's DEFI going to do? And we do have lots of exciting plans. Have a look on our website, but a lot of it depends on the support we get on our collaborations. So do please think also how you can help to work with us to achieve what needs to be achieved for the future of education, and indeed for perhaps creating together a more intelligent planet. So I look forward to a long collaboration with all of you. Thanks very much, and bye-bye.